Okay, so now we're going to look at color sensors. We're going to see if we can use a color sensor to distinguish between different colors, and I'm going to show you how to code that. So we're going to make a new class, once again, in our master branch, our master package. And I've already done one test, so I'm going to call this one color sensor test 2. And I want the public static void, all that, and we'll finish. Start off by deleting their comment. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to actually make the color sensor class. So we're going to go down a few lines and we're going to create that color sensor class. So we're going to write public color sensor test 2. And we're going to use parentheses because it's a class, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And we're going to have to declare that we want a new version of this class up in our main function. So we'll write new color sensor test 2, parentheses, semicolon. And now we just need to define what a color sensor is and what it does. And we can actually write everything just inside of this class. So we want to start with a port. Just for clarity, we're going to make the port its own variable. So I've connected a color sensor to port 1 on my EV3. So remember, when we're using any sensors, we use the ports 1 through 4, and for motors, we use the ABCD ports. So to define our port, we're going to use port as our variable type, and we're going to call it S1 for sensor port 1. And we're going to use the brick finder to get this port. So we're going to use brick finder dot get local to get our local brick, and then we'll use the dot get port. And for this port, we want sensor port 1, so we actually just type capital S and then 1. And we'll use our semicolon at the end, right there. And you will see that it's underlined port. So we want to import this class. There's actually 2 versions of the class. We want to make sure that we use the proper one. So one of these is javix.sound.sample. That's not the correct one. Use the next import, which is the Ledros hardware port. So we'll import that one, and now the program will accept the usage of this variable. So now we're going to actually create the sensor. So we're going to define a few things up here first so that we have global access to these variables. So we're going to set up a sensor by using EV3 color sensor, and we'll just call it sensor as the name of our variable. And we're not going to define it up here. We'll just call it up here, and we need to import the class. We're also going to need a sample provider, which is you need to use a sample provider to get output from any sensor that you use. So we'll create a sample provider as such, and I'm just going to call it color provider. And again, we'll import sample provider. Next, we're going to create an array. It'll be a float array so that we can store the RGB values that we receive from our sensor. So we'll use float with these square brackets to indicate that we're making an array. And we're going to call this color sample. And that will be our array. So back down into our class, we have defined the port. We're actually going to create the sensor now. So we've created the variable. Now we're going to create the sensor. So we'll say sensor, as we defined it up here previously. Sensor is equal to a new EV3 color sensor, and we have to specify the port. So our port, we already made it, so we'll call it S1 because that's what we called it before. Now we want to set the mode for our color provider. So we have color provider. So we want to set its mode to get RGB mode, so that we're getting RGB values from our sensor. So we'll say color provider equals sensor dot get RGB mode. Right there. Close that off. So now we've set the mode for our color provider, and we want to now create our color sample array. So we're going to write color sample equals new float. So we're actually defining the array right now. We created it up here, but now we created the variable for the array. Now we're actually defining the array. So when you make an array in Java, you actually have to define the length of the array. So we'll use the square brackets, and to define the length of the array, we will use the length of the sample size from our color provider, which now exists because we just made the color provider. So we're going to use color provider dot sample size. And the reason that this works is because we set color provider to be in RGB mode, so it will have a sample size of 3, because RGB is 3 values. So we could have probably set this as 3, but just for better practice, we'll put it as color provider dot sample size as the size of our array. So now everything's set up. We want to actually start outputting values from our color sensor. So we're going to do this, and to do this continuously, we're going to use a while loop, and we'll use it like while the escape button is up. So when you press the escape button, you can exit the program. So we'll do this by writing button dot escape dot spell is up, and then we'll use our curly bracket, and then this loop will just repeat and repeat until we press the escape button. Now we don't want just an infinite stream of values, so we're going to use a delay. So as we've used before, delay.msDelay, and we'll set this to maybe 1/4 of a second, so like 250 milliseconds. And now we're going to write just above this line to actually fetch a sample from our color provider. This is the syntax that we use. We write color provider dot fetch sample, and you can see it takes 2 parameters. One of them is sample, so this is the location that we're going to be storing these values, which we want to store in our array. So we'll write color sample, and then there's an offset value, which is just where we store the values in the array. So we're going to start at 0 because arrays start at 0, and we want to start storing the values at that very first index in our array. So now those values will be in our array. We've actually already gotten values out of the color sensor, but we have no idea what they are because we're not displaying them. So we're just going to print those values. So we're going to use system.out and then .print line, which is just print ln. And what this does is it's going to print anything that you want onto your console. So we're going to print the red value that's being output from our color sensor by using quotations, R. You could write whatever you want. You could put red. I'm just going to put R, and then we're going to use the addition sign to show that we're putting 2 different types of values in one print. So we have a string value here, and now we want to add an integer value, or actually it's a float value because we have this float array. So we're going to add the red value, which should be the first value in the table, as that is the order of RGB. So we're going to use our color sample, and we're going to use the first index, which is 0. So what this should output is it should be R for red, and it will list the quantity of red that is being picked up by our sensor. So we're going to copy this line, paste it 2 more times, but we want to do green and blue, and change these values to 1 and 2. So we're getting the first 3 values, and also the only 3 values out of our color sample. And last but not least, let's make sure that we close off our sensor. So sensor dot close. So always close ports when you're finished using them. I'm going to save this, and I have already pulled up and connected to my EV3, so I have the console here. So I'm going to run this program as a Legos EV3 program. We're going to watch our console, and I'll just tell you what I'm doing. So it's going to run. It'll take a few seconds. And you'll see that a light will turn on when you actually try this. A light should turn on your color sensor when it's ready to go. So now you can see it's outputting values. The only issue with these values is that they're very small decimal values. So there is a difference between each value. You could use these to determine what color you're looking at, but it's not exactly ideal. So I'm going to press the escape button to turn off the program. And we're going to go back to our code. And what we're going to do is we're just going to increase all of the values so that it's easier to tell which values are large and which values are small, so we can get a better idea of what color we're looking at. So I'm going to take this value for our red value, put it in brackets, and multiply it by 1000. So that should provide a bigger value for a red. I'm going to do this with all of the values. 1000. And multiply by 1000. So now all the values have been multiplied by 1000. We're going to save that, and hopefully that will make it a little more obvious which color we're looking at. So we're going to run the program again. I'll tell you what colors we should be seeing, and we'll see if the values correspond to that. Okay. So sensor's turning on. I'm starting it over top of a black surface. So you can see we have all low values, all around 10 or under, because we're looking at a black surface right now. If I move this to a white surface, we're going to see all of our values jump quite a bit, anywhere between 100 and 200 sort of range, so much higher values because we're looking at something that's white. And if I bring this over to a red surface, you'll see that our red value is over 100 and all of our other values are below 30. So there's a lot more difference between these values. It becomes a lot easier to distinguish which color is which, so it helps a lot to multiply every value by a constant. I think 1000 is probably the best value to use. And I will press escape to terminate our program. So once again, we create a color sensor class, which should be the same as the class up here. We've actually created the class up here, but we define the class down here. And we have to create the color sensor, attach it to a port. We have to create a color provider and use RGB mode or whatever mode you'd prefer, but I find RGB mode is probably the best for all purposes. And then we need an actual table of float, of the float data type to actually write to so we can get these values. And then that's pretty much it. We just use this fetch sample command to get the samples, and we write to this color sample array that I created. And then we can just output all of these values. And of course, don't forget to close off your sensor port. And that's pretty much it. It's a little confusing at first, but once you start using it, it's pretty straightforward.